It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb.
Well, hello and welcome to Islands at War with myself, Keith Pengelley, and I'm joined, of course, by
Nicola Huray. Hi, Keith. We're back in the studio together after you had a chat with Teresa a couple of weeks ago. That one went out a week ago on Monday, didn't it? And I had a lovely chat with Olive Hammond and her daughter, Ali. If you didn't catch that episode, actually, well, if you didn't catch Teresa's episode, go and find out about her latest book, which is a novel rather than a factual one, but based on the occupation. That Keith had about a half-hour chat with Teresa about that.
And Teresa's was, of course, talk about the sequel to the first novel. So
yes, exactly. And I went and spoke to Olive and Ali. Olive was evacuated at the age of 9 or 10 from Guernsey just before the occupation started. But both of her parents were here. A fascinating and quite emotional story. We talked for a little bit longer than we ended up with in the edit.
It can never be too long.
But Olive has also said she can probably think of a whole load of other things. So she's making a list as she thinks of things. So we may well be hearing from Olive again at some point in the future.
Yes, and I yesterday had a chat with a local lady whose gran is 90-odd, and we might get something there. But more on that, more on that in due course. We only played a little bit of Jim, because we've December 42, Nick. What a lot of stuff we've got to cover off. I think what we're going to do is we're going to do an hour, and I'm almost certain we'll have a second episode.
We will end up with a second episode because you came up with a list of things, and I went and looked at the archives and came up with a whole load of other stuff as well. And I was a bit puzzled, actually, why some of it doesn't get mentioned in the diaries.
Yeah, I mean, mostly, as listeners know, we mine the diaries, and Nick also has got his own archive, and the library's here. But Nick, who will elaborate on this when we get to the relevant points, the salient points, is that there are whole pieces of information that seem to have completely blindsided the diarists. However, more on that on due course, and I think we'll dive into it. So, December 1942. We're recording this very, very first episode on the 24th of July, 2025.
Yeah,
and
happy Christmas.
We don't feel the slightest bit Christmassy, but then again, I don't on Christmas Eve anyway. So enough of that. So one of the things that came up, Nick, is from Herbert Winterflood, and I think really this is the last we'll hear from Herbie. His book sort of terminates in December 1942. But it was about prohibited zones. Herbie writes that the Guernsey Evening Press had devoted a full page to a map of Guernsey denoting the coastal areas that in future would be prohibited to civilians. The prohibited areas included all of the promontories around the island. And I'm going to give a few place names out now because we know some of the listeners like to hear these names mentioned. Some of the promontories and relevant points being Icar, Cherbourg, Plymouth, etc., with just a few exceptions such as St. Peter Port Harbour to Richmond Corner and St. Sampson's northwards towards Bordeaux. And then later in December, it was announced that the prohibited area will be increased from Grand Rock to Port Grass. So those of you with a knowledge of the island and like to hear those place names, the Germans putting several of those out of bounds. And of course, the Germans warned that any person entering the prohibited zones would be at risk of, guess what, being shot. So, which seems to be their sign-off for everything, Nick, isn't it?
It is. And as we've mentioned before, there's some very puzzling terminology sometimes, like around being shot, as in the most serious cases of X, when it's something quite binary, like in the most serious case of trying to escape, or having escaped from the island. Not quite how they're going to shoot you once you've actually escaped. I don't know. I mean, part of this prohibition, well, there's a couple of aspects to this prohibition and forbidden zones being extended. It's partly military from the point of view of they are building a lot of fortifications by this point and they don't want people nosing around. They're also putting in a whole load of minefields, which we'll come to later on, and they don't want people wandering into minefields, etc. But also, there was an escape in September 42, which actually they weren't quite sure if it was an escape or not. So they hadn't made their mind up.
But they seem quite jittery, the Germans, in this period.
They were very jittery because, of course, we were followed by Basalt happened, Operation Basalt right on Sark. They're getting really worried about whether the British are, we covered it in October and November, that they were quite jittery. They were training up people that wouldn't normally be trained up for combat, as well as making them do some stupid exercises, throwing rocks at wooden tanks and stuff like that. So they were very, very jittery about what was going on. So that's kind of the round of why they did that.
And in the wider world, the tide seemed to be turning. It was reverses in North Africa. Stalingrad has really sort of ground to a halt, or the Russian front rather. So, and of course, we were having combatants coming back to the island that had seen what was going on in those areas. So, the Germans were really starting now to a lot of them were thinking, well, what have we started? And we're fearing the worst. I think that would be true to say.
Yeah, and we'll see in December 42, there's a lot of movement of personnel going on as well.
And also a rotation of slaves, which we'll get on to later.
Come to that as well.
Just one thing on the prohibited areas. Mr. Sovery, in his diary, Mr. Sovery lived in St. Sampson's near a small township we call the Bridge. He writes that there are now 4 large concrete gate pillars opposite John's the Butcher's. And John's the Butcher's is still there. It's not John's Butcher's anymore, but you can see on the marble front, it still says John the Butcher's.
Says that, yeah, absolutely.
And the whole of the north side and the north and south quays were closed to the public. So really that whole area really would become a militarised zone.
Yeah, they'd cracked down on who could go around the harbours and made it a lot more difficult. I mean, it wasn't easy in the first place, but they really cracked down on who could access the harbour area, which caused a few problems for people.
Now, we've also got this people being forced to register to work with the Germans, and I think you've turned up something there. Islanders must register for labour index as the headline.
Yeah. So the Germans, we've mentioned this before, but if for any of our new listeners or anybody that didn't catch any of the episodes where we mentioned it, the Germans had their own interpretation of the Hague Convention and the Geneva Convention. They used to twist the facts a little bit to suit themselves, sometimes quoting accurately the Geneva Convention or the Hague Convention, but more often than not, they used to twist the wording of it and interpret it to their own advantage. So, you were not permitted as the occupying force to force civilians of the occupied place to actually work for you on fortifications and stuff like that. And that was one thing that the controlling committee here and the Superior Council in Jersey were very mindful of and pushed back on a lot.
Yeah, so just to be clear, you couldn't conscript a local Channel Islander to sort of have a pick and shovel to work on the fortification.
You couldn't force them to, no.
No, but surely there's been a sort of grey area about driving concrete, cement.
That's where the grey line.
Yeah, exactly.
Where a bit of a grey line is. Now, by December 42, this is causing the Germans a problem because they don't have enough local workers to work on things. The local government's got a problem because they don't have enough people, or rather they need more information to be able to allocate workers to the correct areas to try and support the island. Now, the Germans are seized on this, and although this notice is published by the Guernsey government, they ostensibly for the labour index, so that they can identify, are people all gainfully employed? Well, realistically, to be honest, they had to be because they couldn't afford to live if they weren't.
Yes, there was no benefits, particularly. Really,
I mean, they were looking to squeeze extra people into it. So, if you were 14 years old, then your name is going on the list.
14.
In Dad's Army fashion, your name will also go on the list. Yeah. So your parents were responsible for, if you were under 18, for putting your name on the list. In fact, the head of a household had to put everybody on the list. And then if he was married, his wife had to complete her own form as well as be on that list. So they were looking to see if there was anybody basically being supported by, say, a husband supporting a wife.
So it was almost like a census. So
almost. And so the Germans had also put out a notice basically saying that there was an order that you could not refuse to provide services or goods to the Germans. and that was punishable. This come out about the same time. So they've forced this list to be. I mean, as I say, it was of use to the local government anyway, but they pretty much had no choice. They had to do this. So the notice was published several times in the Guernsey press. You had a form there to cut out. The copies of the press that I've got at home, actually, a number of them have that bit missing. I do have one that has got that form intact. So they were trying to utilise it to force people to work. Now, as it happens, the argument was won in terms of they couldn't make people go and work directly on the fortifications, but as you say, a lot of people ended up as drivers. The other attraction being the fact that the Germans were paying a lot more than you could get paid working for anybody else.
Right. So even though it was being paid in Reichsmarks, they were trying to lure local people to work for them by paying them more.
It wasn't real money anyway, as far as
they could use it in the shops if there was anything in the shops.
From the point of view of the Germans, they could just keep printing it, so it didn't really matter. And that plays into something else that we're going to talk about a little bit later on, as to why that would be so attractive to people. It's quite a complicated situation.
But also, of course, we should remember that if people, even for higher pay, wanted to go and work on the fortifications, that people were being really, there was a debilitation through starvation, through malnutrition.
Yeah.
When, everybody was affected. And, to go looking for heavy work like that wouldn't have, people wouldn't have had a calorific intake that would have enabled them to work this sort of work for long, would they?
No, exactly. No. I mean, if you were a labourer, a manual labourer, you did get additional rations, but not huge amounts.
No. Okay, reports that the Germans are leaving. This seemed to have swept through both islands?
Yeah, it did. It swept through both islands. This was a recurring theme. It happened quite a lot. And it's understandable why these rumours were getting around. I mean, firstly, the Germans were going around, some of the German personnel were going around telling people these stories. So,
that's defeatist talk, isn't it?
Well, exactly. I mean, who knows? But also they were seeing, because there were, we've touched on this before, you've got a lot of the younger men and better trained men are being shipped off of the island. Not all of them, but,
well, specialists would have stayed here. Right?
But chunks of them were being carted off and going to the Eastern Front or to other places. And also the Germans were rejigging some of their military equipment, so there's guns being moved and stuff like that. So, I mean, if we look, Ambrose Robin, who was an administrator at the State's Insurance, so it basically...
Which island is that, Nick?
He's Guernsey.
In Guernsey,
yeah. So Ambrose was basically administering the State's Insurance scheme, so that was basically paying people unemployment if they were unemployed, or paying benefits to help people and stuff like that.
Oh, so there was some sort of state relief.
Yeah, and he was running the Oddfellows as well. He was a busy chap, and he was also doing things like trying to help people. He wasn't involved in billeting, but he'd have people that would come to him at his office and say, well, the Germans are kicking me out. I need to go somewhere else.
And he's a civil servant.
He's a civil servant, yeah. And the Germans are kicking me out of my house next week. If they were lucky enough to have a week's notice, I need somewhere to go. People that came to Ambrose tended to be people who maybe had a relative who was an invalid. There's one case of a lady that needed, a certain type of accommodation because she was disabled. And that, was causing problems. They were trying to find somewhere. So that's the sort of person that turned up on Ambrose Robin's doorstep, because obviously he was their point of contact for other assistance around that sort of thing. So he wasn't a billeting officer or anything like that. But he used to then go and talk to people in various bits of the civil service and say, look, Mr. So-and-so and his wife have got a problem. They're being kicked out by the Germans. They need a suitable property that they can live in. She's, not very well, got some sort of disease or something, or some sort of physical impairment, which means that she can't, for instance, can't go and live in a 2-story house or whatever. So he used to go and do stuff like that as well. But he, as part of his job, obviously had a lot of contact with the Germans, and he reported in his diary on the 7th of December that the German harbour master had said they were all off before Christmas. Mostly the military and naval personnel in Guernsey would be below 1,500 by Christmas, which, when you think there were about 10,000, that's a heck of a lot of people. He said another rumour that was circulating was the wife of a local worker who'd gone to work in Alderney had applied to the commandant for a permit to allow her husband to come to Guernsey for Christmas. And when she went to apply for this, she was told he'd soon be free to come back, as the Germans would be leaving the islands very soon. So there was that.
I mean, it's pretty. The rumours that were going around were quite detailed in themselves.
Yeah,
and for that reason, almost believable.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And the German harbour master, and we've talked about him a little bit before. He wasn't averse to turning a bit of a blind eye to help out local fishermen and things like that. But they also talk about this. Lesotho also talks about this as well, and he's quite sceptical about it. So Philip Lesotho, running a building merchant in Jersey, we've talked about him quite a bit. We've talked about the fact that he was very fond of his motorcycle.
Yes,
in fact, more fond of his motorcycle than a young lady that was showing him some attention. If you listen to some of the earlier episodes, I discovered the other day, I hadn't realised this, I hadn't put two and two together, but he actually was very much involved in the racing scene post-war.
Oh, right, okay.
And was actually involved...
Motor racing.
Yeah, motor racing. He was involved in organising... They had a Grand Prix in Jersey because they couldn't use any of the circuits in the UK, and it was, I think it was 48 or 49, something like that, maybe early 50s. There was a series of them, but there was one that was actually classed as being a Formula One race.
Well, we have spoken up when we do get to the end of the war. We will do a sort of legacy.
Yeah. He was involved in organising that. Unfortunately, he was killed in 1967. He died in a boating accident. Anyway, more of that, we're disappearing down a rabbit hole there. But anyway, Lesotho was talking about these reports and rumours that the Germans would be leaving soon.
Yeah, I mean, he says here that according to the reports, Jersey, for example, all Channel Islands were to be put under International Red Cross, who would arrange for our feeding and so forth, and food will be brought from France on a ship under the Jersey flag, and a defence force set up to keep the Russian and other foreign labourers under control. This is a really sort of...
It's quite a detailed rumour.
Well, it's almost as if it had been built rationally, this rumour, if rumours can be built, put together and released into the community deliberately, It's very detailed.
It is quite detailed, and where it came from, who knows. And he talks about this local defence force is supposed to be formed, presumably unarmed, to keep control over the Russian and foreign labourers. Well, to be fair, good luck with that. If you weren't armed, well, you'll find out why in due course, either in this episode or the second part. But Lesotho was like, I don't really think there's anything to this, but I'm going to record it anyway. Again, like Audie, he's very good at recording things and saying, well, I don't know if this is correct. It's a rumour.
Yeah, very circumspect.
And then he'll come back to it later on.
Yeah. Increase in supplies. It was reported that there had been an increase in the receipt of supplies from France. So, for example, in the period July to December 1940, there had been 33 cargoes of goods and the foodstuffs. But in the 6 months up to December 42, there had been 100 ships arriving. So, as things seem to be getting worse, there appear to be more ships. That seems to be counterintuitive. So what was going on?
There's a whole load of stuff that gets put out by the Germans. Some of it ostensibly, written by the local newspaper and stuff like that. They also got some of these articles were inside the newspaper, which was unusual because most of their propaganda appeared on the front page.
Yes, yeah.
And by the time you got to the inside of the newspaper, we're only talking about 4 or 5 pages most of the time anyway. So there's this story that appears which says that it was reported there had been an increase in receipt of supplies from France. In the period from July to December 1940, there'd been 33 cargoes of goods and foodstuffs, a total of 8,011 tons. But in the 6 months up to December 1942, there'd been 100 ships, with part of the cargoes being for civilians. Now, this was a massive budge by the Germans, because you've got to think about this, right? So those 33 cargoes in the first 6 months of the occupation, well, things were still getting organised. Nothing had really...
You didn't really need to bring any more than that in.
No, and the thing was, they weren't really organised in terms of getting stuff from France for the civilian population. That didn't really start until August. So you a very short time frame. Now, and it's quite telling that whilst they mentioned that there was 1,000 tons of coal in the 6 months to December 42, they don't actually put a number on how much the rest of the stuff that they'd bought in was. Now, there was undoubtedly more stuff in the shops in December 42 than perhaps earlier on in
and this is imported in. More imported goods.
So there were more imported goods, but there was an awful lot of stuff that was secondhand. We've talked about the barter shops and stuff like that. So it's a bit of smoke and mirrors. There was a later article that appeared where basically, and clearly again written by the Germans, saying that, they were looking forward to 1943 because the islands were now self-sufficient, which is utter cobblers.
Yeah, even with much reduced population.
Anybody walking around St. Peter Port in December 1942 would have known that was complete and utter rubbish. But there we go. They did that. I mean, they'd also imported, this article also talks about live cattle being bought in, but they were careful to keep them away from the Guernsey cows. To protect the purity. They want to protect the purity of the Guernsey cows, and the same in Jersey. So they actually kept them segregated, these cows that were brought in effectively for slaughter for food. So in Jersey, they kept them down at the harbour, for instance.
To this day, it's not a case of paranoia, but the breed, the purity of our breeds of cattle must be preserved at all costs. So even in the war, and as we say, the live cattle have been imported for the first time since the Norman Conquest. And you put the rider here, Nick, that they're very careful to keep Guernsey cows and protect the purity of the breed, and the same in Jersey. And that could have been the thin end of the wedge. It doesn't seem to be much, but it means a lot to us over here.
Yeah, actually, just looking at the article, they did put in how many tons of things. I'm just quickly adding it up in my head. And actually, the number of, that's 5, 6, 7, 2, actually it's about 8,600. So they're 100 ships actually bought in marginally less.
Yes,
if you do the maths. Yeah. It's just the way they've written the article.
Yeah. And of course, much of the imported, if not all of the imported goods for the civilians were bought in France or from France with a purchasing committee, which was made up of W.G. Herbert, P.A. Mai, George Vaudin and R.J. Barnett. Raymond Fuller headed the team up. I think one of the Guernsey men was resident in Granville.
George Vaudin.
It was George Vaudin. Yeah, he was resident, like an agent there, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, and Raymond Fuller, beg your pardon, travelled over ceaselessly, really. And it was really, the Germans must have given them passes to do so. And where did they get the money for all this purchasing then that they were doing?
This was basically borrowed from the banks in a lot of cases. So they borrowed money off of what were National Westminster banks.
So this is the States of Guernsey borrowed it from.
Yeah, so it's quite complicated. There were British banks in Paris that were still operating during the war.
Yeah,
but obviously not in contact with their head office in
London or
wherever.
Yeah.
So the banks here, a group of the banks here, lent money to the government here, but they had to get it.
So there was a British bank in Paris effectively had cash reserves or had lines of credit.
Well, it is
complicated.
We could do an entire episode on it, but basically the banks here had to guarantee the Paris branches. It was to literally physically move money.
Yeah.
Some of which went missing on
Real,
on the way to Gronville when it was in the custody of the Germans. Funny that, eh? They got their hands on stuff. Now, December 42, there's a whole other aspect to this as well, because the Germans are cracking down on currencies that can be used here. So they made the franc not legal tender here. Just going back to the borrowing from the banks, basically we were 7 million quid in hock by Guernsey.
That's £7 million in money then.
About 350 million in today's money.
Wicked.
And there was a deal done after the war about that, but we'll talk about that when we get to that, part of things. But so they had to raise money to basically buy stuff. So we were buying it for ourselves. A lot of the stuff that got shipped in, if the Germans were running low on stuff, they'd ask if they could borrow some whatever, I mean, potatoes was the main thing that they used to borrow. So we'll repay you next month with the same amount of potatoes.
So the term borrow they made an offer that it couldn't be refused.
Exactly. I mean, there was not a lot that could be done. I mean, they protested a lot about these sort of things. But so the trade links were key from that point of view. But I came across another thing which was actually in the same edition of the press. The Guernsey press occasionally used to publish letters, but didn't always have room to publish them because they were constrained by the fact that sometimes they only had 4 pages.
Yes.
It was printed on various sizes of paper depending on when in the occupation and what paper they could get. But I thought this was quite good because it's from December 42 and it's the editor's letter bag and it's entitled What Our Readers Would Like. And it's got a selection of letters.
Heavily filtered, I would have thought.
Well, yeah. Well, Mr. Fred Noyon of Vale Avenue, he's got a good point here. I'm with him on this one. He wants to know where all the pork's going that comes from the pigs that have been killed since the occupation has started. Because he said, well, we keep getting a beef ration, but we don't get any pork. When a pig's killed, the owner is allowed to retain a certain portion, but what happens to the rest? I think we can work out what happens to the rest.
Yeah, because there was this thing about, and if you remember in previous episodes, pigs were being sold by being cut in half after being, appropriately butchered. But the Germans worked out that they were getting the smaller half, and then so they were cutting them, if you like, across the middle, where there was then be cut ways. So you had halves.
They in 42 actually had specific about these sort of animals. These were a gentleman for not reporting a dig. He got caught out because the Germans went round to check. And on their list, it said he had 2 pigs, and he could only produce one for them to see. Basically, he said, the other one was lame, and I had to put it down yesterday, and I just haven't managed to get to report it yet. So that's why that they weren't interested. He got fined 10 quid.
Yeah, which was a lot of money, of course.
Absolutely. And the other things that are mentioned in here is just wanting a decent loaf of bread for Christmas.
Yeah. Another lady wanted to receive a pound of chocolate.
Yeah, and we've got the inequality of tobacco. Now, bearing in mind the large quantity of people that used to smoke, the ladies were somewhat in uproar because they weren't getting a tobacco ration and the men would. So, this lady writes in and says, the fact that males are to receive additional tobacco rations this Christmas has raised the ire of some of the fair sex. Hopefully, Dido thinks that the women over 18 deserve a little extra at Christmastide, addressing the controlling committee, who says, open up and give the women folk their first Christmas box.
Yes,
an extra ration of chocolate or biscuits. I'm sure they would appreciate it as much as the smokers do.
Yeah, her nom de plume is Hopeful Dido.
Yes, yeah. Nearly all of the letters are published with a nom de plume.
Yeah, but try saying that with a cigarette in your mouth, yeah.
And there's a woman who writes in who says she's a lonely woman. The correspondent is called Fair Play. She's, just pointing out that, she's one of the lonely women in Guernsey at the time. There's a bit of moaning about greengrocery prices as well, which is kind of tied into something else that we're going to talk about. Now, the other thing I came across, and I'd not heard about this, I presume you pronounce this kohlrabi or something.
Oh, yes.
Like
this is Guernsey's new vegetable.
brand new, straight from Germany.
Yeah.
So I had to look it up. I mean, everybody who listens to this knows I'm not a massive fan of vegetables. But anyway, so I had to look this up to find out what it was. The article, again, probably penned by the Germans, says this tastes very good sprouts, pleasant nutty flavour. And it says it's got the food value as the same of Swedes, and it's very healthy, giving you lots of vitamins.
I've grown it, but mine got a sort of beetle, so I managed to make some. But the other thing, Nick, it says it can be sliced and mashed, and is very enjoyable cold with some kind of mayonnaise sauce.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you're going to manage to make mayonnaise of this. And some kind of I mean, that doesn't sound...
not like mayonnaise, some kind of
yeah. But yeah, you must eat it freely because it's very poor if it's stored, apparently.
Yeah. I can see you're not terribly enthusiastic.
No.
Okay, moving on. Auctions. The Guernsey press reported that housewives were now attending weekly auctions whereby they might be able to obtain items no longer found in shops. In other words, people auctioning off what they had in their own private stocks. In one instance, a single packet of pins came up for an auction, and I think you've seen something else.
Yeah, there's in December 42 in the newspapers, there's quite long lists of what things that are being auctioned off. Even down to packets of matches. I mean, it's not the normal sort of stuff you'd see coming up in an auction. Earlier on in the occupation, it's things like furniture and stuff like that. I mean, and that is still going on, but there's down to very small items that are just generally unobtainable.
Yeah. And the black market's still a problem?
This is partly why things are being auctioned off. So the black market. Now, if things are going so well and we're self-supporting... Yeah. Why have we got a big black market going on then? So there's a whole series of articles that appear in the press. I mean, there's one which is headlined, Sarnia combats the black market. Efforts to stamp out pernicious wartime evil. And it's quite a long article, so I'm not going to read it out. But the gist of it is that they're basically saying, the black market's unfair. Some people who can afford to get stuff on the black market are doing it at the expense of others, which I can totally see. This goes back to the point where we were saying about the fact that if you went to work for the Germans driving a lorry or doing some sort of building work, not of a military nature, but working on roads or something like that, or working as a cook for the Germans or something, you could get quite a lot more money than you would get if you were doing that for the local government, which of course then gave you buying power to buy stuff.
More disposable income.
Now, there were a whole rash of court cases about the black market that appear in December 42. There's quite a few people that get either fined or sentenced to prison. And this article goes on to say that basically the black market is not as good. It's not reached the alarming proportions that have been established in other countries. Clearly, this is written by a German.
Yeah.
This is not written by somebody local. And it talks about this may be due to insular awareness of the law. I can't imagine anybody local would have used that as being a phrase.
No.
And then it goes on about people being part of the reason that it's not as bad is people here would be mortified about finding themselves in court and, just a minor infraction.
Yeah, I mean, when I was, listening to tales of the occupation, in the early 60s, this came up because there's always this feeling that people in the countryside were better off because, they may have lived in farms, etc.
Yeah.
And then rather than the people in the town, well, my family didn't live in the countryside and they didn't really live in town. They lived in sort of, in the St. Martin's area, which doesn't mean a lot to everybody. The problem for my family is the men were away fighting.
Yeah. My
gran was the only person that could bring anything in. She was looking after small children and very old people. And she wouldn't have had the muscle or the buying power to get into the black market. So some people, they were just priced out of it, weren't they?
Yeah,
and they
absolutely.
had no way to muscle their way in at all.
Yeah, and there's another letter that appeared in the Guernsey press in December 42 from a lady who was working as a secretary because she was on her own and she got a job as a secretary. But she was complaining, well, I'm at work when I could be going to go and get my rations and
standing in queues and things.
And I'm not allowed to go. And it causes me massive problems and whatever. But, that is part of the problem. And one of the cases that they cite, and I hadn't really thought about this until I looked at it, was if you took milk, for example. It was being monitored by the state's dairy board.
Yeah, they had inspectors.
They did. And there were potato inspectors as well, and various other inspectors. But what they did was they were monitoring the dairy farmers' herds and the milk yield from those. If there was a sudden drop in that, then they'd send somebody along to go and have a look. And it wasn't just a passing, let's go and see him, we'll go and ask him what's happened. Why have you not got so much milk? They send these inspectors along, and what they're looking for is they go and measure the amount of milk that's obtained from milking in the morning, amount of milk from the afternoon. They actually watch it, see how much is obtained, and whether that tallies with what's being turning up at the dairy.
Yeah, and that would be, it's interesting from a curfew pass point of view. So these inspectors must have been given passes to be out that early. In order,
well, potentially, yeah, depending on what time the farmers were.
Very early in the morning.
Were milking. But apparently, some of the farmers were trying to get around this by a bit of late night milking, or milking the cows earlier in the afternoon. But the paper warns that basically our inspectors aren't stupid. They know what they're doing, and they will catch you if you're doing that sort of activity, and you'll be in a lot of trouble.
Well, it just goes to show that there was a concerted effort to there was a rationale to try and cut out some of this supply into the black market.
So this was just one of the measures that they were using. There's a whole series of articles that appear about the black market, and also it's kind of tied in as well with the control of money going in and out of the islands. So they issued an order which was, as I mentioned earlier, making the French franc no longer able to be used as legal tender. They gave a very short time frame for you to be able to exchange any francs that you had. We know that people were hanging on to their pounds, shillings and pence because they all had an eye to the fact that money was going to be worth something at the end of the war, and they very much hoped that the Reichsmark would be worth absolutely diddly squat, because that would have meant that the Germans had lost. So there's that going on as well. And it caused such a problem that in December 1942, the gas company actually had to put out a notice saying that because there was a shortage of shillings for putting in your gas meter, they were now basically able to send an inspector around at the start of the month, and you could pay him in advance for your entire gas ration, because then you didn't have to use the coins, etc. Now, the whole gas and electric thing was pretty tough, because that, along with this appeal about, can you pay in advance, etc., that there was the slap that says, of course, you know what happens if you exceed your gas ration. We'll just cut you off.
Yeah.
And the same applied to electricity as well. So if you were trying to use more than you should have done, and
yes, this is reflected in some of the panic in the diaries. Violet Carey, in particular, mentions that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a real problem for people, because particularly around December 1942, January 1943, when they were going through a pretty horrible winter.
Yeah.
Although that said, most of the winters in the occupation seemed, or certainly the latter part of the occupation, middle to the latter part of the occupation, seemed to have been pretty horrific.
Yeah, it's probably worth doing a bit of research on that, because whether it might just be people feeling the cold war, and because of lack of stimulus, mental, and maybe the weather is just pressing in on you.
There's possibly an element of that, but there is, in December, January, February of 1945, there's really, really quite an unprecedented amount of snowfall.
Oh, right.
Okay. There's a lot So and a lot of gales. And like you say, people might be writing this down more often, but there are actual records which prove that they were some pretty horrible winters.
Yeah.
So yeah, and going back to the auctions and things like that, there was as well. You've got the problem of Christmases coming up.
Yeah, I was just going to say we need to talk about Christmas. Yeah.
What do you give your kids?
Yeah.
Where are you going to get stuff from? So there were adverts in the newspapers where some of the shops were advertising, bring in your old toys that you don't need or whatever, we'll buy them off of you.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about Christmas in Christmas 1942 here on Guernsey on the 21st of December. All of the St. Peter Port primary school children were invited to a dinner at the Lower Central Hall, which is it's now gone, but it was in.
Yeah, I had a look at this, and most people probably won't know where this was. I don't actually know when it was knocked down, but if who's familiar with come along Haviland Street, you get to the junction with Union Street and Allay Street. If you turn right down Allay Street, there's a left turn almost immediately, which has got a barrier that goes up and down. It's a privately rented out car park. Now, by my powers of deduction and working out that Central Hall Limited owns the land and the Central Hall no longer exists, that would appear to be. And I've checked with a few people and they've said, that's where it was. But nobody seems to be able. I must look into it more. People to tell me when that was actually knocked down. But so 180 kids went there.
And then on to the Regal Cinema to be entertained. Now, interestingly, so this is just St. Peter Port children. Children then from all of the island schools were to join them at the Regal, and that there had been an appeal for sugar so the children might have some sweets. Now, my father would have been 8. And I wonder if he was there.
Well, who knows? I mean, there was quite a lot done around the island for children, actually, and it's one of the things throughout the occupation. I guess people were going short on their own ration to make sure that their kids had stuff, which is understandable. The St. Sampson School writes in on the 4th of January, 1943, asking to be allowed to express through the medium of your valued paper the grateful thanks to all those helped in many and varied ways to give the children of St. Sampson Schools a wonderful treat for their Christmastide. The people obviously went all in to help through either giving money, gifts, decorations, foodstuffs, and to give away food was a.
Yeah, you're highlighting St. Sampson's School there. And Sauvery in his diary, because he lived in St. Sampson's and was part of the church community, that comes out very much in trying to give the Sunday school children a little something, And I think it was Ord as well mentioned that he was walking through town and this German vehicle pushed through the crowd and a little boy had just come out of a shop with this second-hand toy that was for him for Christmas and dropped it, and the German vehicle ran over it, and this poor little child just watched this happen.
Yeah. One other thing about Christmas that I was a bit confused about was in Jersey. Now, anybody who listened to our December 41 episode will know the Germans made a big thing about the fact that they were extending curfew. So
they did.
For Christmas and New Year, how wonderful we are. We're being jolly nice to you and we're giving you an extended curfew, which they'd done in 1940 as well. Well, didn't happen in 1942 in Guernsey. It caused a lot of problems for people. So basically, if you wanted to be with all of your family for Christmas and if you wanted to stay in the evening, you had to stay at their house.
And you had to fill in forms.
Oh, you had to fill in forms.
Lots of forms.
We'll come to those a bit later. There was a flipping long order about that one. I mean, you were supposed to do that anyway, but they really
went to town.
They really went to town on it. It's an enormous amount of information that he had to give. But we'll come to that one, I suspect, possibly in the next episode of December 42. But strangely, normally all of the orders
were universal.
Were across the Channel Islands.
Yep.
Not in this case, because Lesotho records that it was extended. And he's writing the diary at the time, so it's not a case of he's thought about this, three years later,
yes,
or 10 years later when he's writing a book.
Misremembers it. Yeah.
He wrote 5 because the diaries that are out, or rather the diary that is published by Philip Lesota is basically some key bits of the 5 volumes that he wrote. He also, I discovered, that was able to borrow documents. He had a man on the inside who was getting him documents so that he could copy them overnight. It was correspondence between the Germans and the Jersey government, and he had a chap who was borrowing some of the documents that he thought he might be interested in, letting him have them overnight so he could transcribe any interesting bits, and then getting them back to where they were supposed to be before anybody noticed, which it was quite interesting. So Lesota recorded it at the time, and they did get a longer curfew. So why it's different between the islands today? It may, I suppose, be some sort of carryover from the escape and from Basalt. They were still very nervous about Guernsey. Yeah. Maybe they weren't so bothered about Jersey because there hadn't been any commando raids on Jersey.
No, well, that's a good point.
So maybe they were a little bit, who knows? But I mean, there's an article in Guernsey Press which talks about visiting Christmas, and it talks about the fact that it was difficult for Christmas and New Year, although people said, it might have been worse. It was the phrase that was echoed. I suspect that was perhaps a little bit tongue-in-cheek, as in, it could have been a lot worse. It was pretty bad, but. But so, the curfew made it necessary for any jollification to take place in island homes. People weren't able to go out.
Our diarist, Reverend Maud, on Christmas Day 1942, he recalls that he spent Christmas Day with their friends the Blanpiers from La Fosse in St. Martin's, which was just a stone's throw from where my family, or part of my family, would have been. And he records that the Blanpiers keep a radio hidden in a bucket which is kept on the roof of an outhouse, so Ord is able to listen to and write down the King's speech, which was a big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Ambrose Robin was up to no good as far as the Germans were concerned on Christmas Day, because they not only toasted the King, he had a number of friends and relatives around at his house, and he seems to have done all right. Now, I don't know if he was involved in any black market stuff, but he had dined on beef and rabbit and vegetables, followed by, now this doesn't sound quite so appetizing, a Christmas pudding of sorts, which actually contained a few prunes and raisins for dried grapes from Braemar. Now, that was a vinery that he actually owned.
Yeah.
And a few bits of dried banana in there for good measure. He also noticed that they had rice pudding and, in brackets, put real rice. All of this was served under the Union Jack. Now, that was risky.
Yeah.
And for dessert, they had grapes, and their first toast was the King, then absent friends, our guests, our hosts, etc., etc. They then spent the afternoon around the fire with real tea.
Yeah, I've seen that.
That must have been kept specially for the occasion, because nigh on impossible to get. It was about a year before this that Ord had his last cup of real tea from a cafe, and only because he telephoned ahead to reserve some. So, so they had supper at 7:30, as there was no extension of the curfew, and the excuse the Germans gave was reasons of military necessity. No. So that's what made me think it was more around the proximity to Basalt, Operation Basalt as well. Yes. I mean, they were still in November 42, they were still hauling people over from Sark to give them a good questioning, because they were convinced that these guys must have had some help from the civilian population.
Nick's referring to the Basalt raid, the raid on Sark, which you can catch in September episode.
Yeah.
So if you're new to the podcast, you can work your way through, catch up exactly what we're talking about.
I mean, then we were talking about the black market just before, but Ambrose Robin records in the same entry for Christmas Day that he says, writing of real tea reminds me of a fellow islander who had a fine goose for Christmas, value about £15. A week or two ago, he was offered £2 of tea and 2 bottles of whiskey, now worth several pounds per bottle. The goose was exchanged for the above. £1 of tea was put into an auction sale and realised £10. But he's not doing too bad on his investment.
Yeah.
2 nutmegs were 8 and 6 each. Rabbits now cost anything from £1 to £2 and sometimes more. The Germans are increasing wages everywhere as money is no object to them while they can produce it so cheaply. Back to the point I made about they were just printing it willy-nilly anyway, and it was because they were also not impacting their own economy by doing that, because we had our own Reichsmarks in the Channel Islands that couldn't be used elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, and they received part of their pay in that, so it wasn't going to impact them.
Red Cross messages continued to make news because a lady had recently agreed to become engaged after receiving a proposal of marriage from her boyfriend. The proposal had arrived in a 25-word Red Cross message. So he sent this, so he would have to wait for it to be received.
Yeah.
It's a bit like getting an email from Saturn or something. You know?
Well, or a text message. Back in the days of the old, you could only send a text message of so many words or whatever. But
but the waiting period. What's she going to say?
He'd have been on tenterhooks probably for the best part of 6 months, because it quite often took 3 months for the message to get here, if it got here.
Yeah, and it made the local papers. It says the proposal was sent in, and the 25 words from the lady's male friend, now in England, and we have it, that the reply will be yes.
The article also records that it's rather heartening and unusual to hear of a young lady working in one of the state's departments here who's become engaged through a Red Cross message, mostly because other Sarnians are sending messages to other young folk in Guernsey now overseas, saying that they were breaking up with them.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the other side to it.
So at least that's a little bit more cheerful.
Now, I think sort of maybe one of our final things for this first episode of 2 episodes about December 1942, wirelesses that are not given up. The Germans realised that not all wirelesses had been given up when they had requested that earlier in the year, and they were aware that there were still lots of radio sets in use, certainly in Guernsey, despite the fact that they should have been handed in the previous June, in fact, and they decided that no action will be taken if the sets were handed in before December the 31st. So they're sort of allowing people to have them for Christmas, weren't they?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think it turned up very many radios.
No.
To be fair. I mean, Lesotho actually complains about the fact that so many people have got radios now. He records the fact that they had this notification in Jersey as well. He says accurate details are hard to get, with listening being done in difficult conditions. But I gather the reference to those of us who remained was confined to a few platitudes, because he was talking about the fact that apparently there had been a broadcast which had mentioned the Channel Islands. And he says, I'm surprised, since Britain knows we have no radio, apart from all the crystal sets and everything else, no leaflets have been dropped to keep us in touch with developments. Not that it matters, for such things are liable to be a source of trouble, and amazing how quickly news travels. In any case, when there has been anything special on the radio, I've almost always found my efforts to pass it on to trusted friends have been wasted, because they already know about it. So he was bemoaning it. But, the Germans were saying that they were going to strictly impose a fine or imprisonment, or in some cases, death.
Of course.
If you had your radio.
Yes.
Can't forget the old death thing in there, because this is one of the... Now, they didn't actually execute anybody from the Channel Islands. Now, we know about the sad stories about people who were shipped off, the Jewish ladies, and also the Francis Scornet, who was shot in Jersey because he was a Frenchman who'd come with a party of French people, and he was shot to make an example of. But there was always this nagging fear that they might actually do it, and the Germans kept that in the back of people's minds, not through making what ostensibly, if you just read all of these orders where they trundled out as the last sentence of it, your death in severe cases. They actively were publishing on a fairly regular basis, the names and sometimes photographs on posters or in the newspapers of people who've been shot in France for doing some sort of activity, so sabotage or some other activity like that. And that must have been deliberate, because why on earth would anybody here have been bothered about knowing about their own problems? Why would they want to know about somebody being shot in the south of France because they'd carried out an act of sabotage? The only reason that they'd be publishing this sort of stuff has got to be to make them think, well, maybe they would do it here.
Or just, what the Germans are like, we're only obeying orders. Someone says, make sure this is distributed in all occupied territory. But I think it was here we were supposed to say, look, we really will do it if we're pushed that far.
I think it was to try and control the population by keeping it in the back of people's minds. I mean, Lesotho talks about, he takes this quite lightly. He's, he talks about this notice and the fact it threatens death. And he says, so there is another score on which I've incurred the threat of a death penalty. As far as the immunity clause is concerned, knowing the Germans, I doubt it. Even if the offence were overlooked, it's pretty certain once you've got your name into their black books, there's a distinct possibility of being yanked in for some other minor offence. And that's very much the case. A number of the young men that attempted to escape from Jersey, it was quite often because they'd come to the attention of the Germans, been involved in something, maybe had a short prison sentence, but then were continually, the Germans were trying to find something else to get them
hassling
for.
out.
So there's a number where they said in their accounts post-war or in their interviews with MI19 that I thought they were closing in on me. I was, something bad was going to happen to me, so I decided I was going to escape. So it very much was. If your name appeared in their black book with a black mark against it, then there was a chance that they were going to do something. Now, Lesotho also makes an interesting point. Is that there's a lot of German soldiers going around offering to buy radios off civilians because
that's a honey trap sort of thing.
Well, no, I think they genuinely just
But where were the Germans going to listen to them? Back when they're in their billets and things.
In their billets, yeah. But and it says a good number have been confiscated without even informing their owners anyway. Those who voluntarily wish to sell their sets have to sell to a specified dealer, who in turn must sell to Germans wishing to buy, thus removing the threat. But he says a surprising number of people are selling, apparently, because they will be taken away. But most cases that I've read about where people did sell their radio, it was because they already had two. They tended to keep the good one and flog the one that's not quite so good.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, that seems to be a good place to end our first episode. I think this is the first time with a monthly episode we've sort of had so much information to make it into two. We've already gone through past the hour mark.
Yeah, we've got a lot of stuff to cover. I mean, just to whet your appetite. I mean, we've got a whole thing around orders about foreigners in hotels, which is, as Keith said, who were these people? Well, we'll come to that. It's quite complicated and why they were putting that out.
Charcoal burning buses?
Yep. We've got a large number of Russians rampaging around Jersey and causing all sorts of havoc. We've got a murder in Jersey, which we'll talk about as well, which was particularly sad. And then we've got some military operations going on as well. We've got
a convoy that was attacked.
Yeah, a convoy was attacked. Got quite a bit on that, and that was witnessed. I've got some stuff on the aircraft that took part. Contrary to what was recorded in a lot of the diaries, it says it was Spitfires, but it wasn't. I think it's one of those things where islanders were just like, oh, if it looked like a fighter, it was a Spitfire. So,
well, you've got some Royal Canadian Air Force work to do as well, eh?
I've got some stuff that I need to look at. Royal Canadian Air Force Wellington went down. I can track down what raid it was on, but I just need to find out some more information. That went down off the coast of Guernsey near Albany.
Right, so shall we bid the listeners happy Christmas?
Oh, no, I can't bring myself to it. But we'll be back with part 2, and maybe I'll be feeling it a bit more by the time we record that episode at some point in the next week.
We'll record it soon, so by the time you hear this, it's done. But it will be done very soon. So I think with that, we'll just say goodbye and catch the rest of December 1942. In the next week or two. So it's bye from Keith, and also then
cheerio from Nick.
Okay, thank you very much for your continued support. Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.